Welcome back. Uh, in this video, we're going to talk about Python loops. And whenever you think about a loop, you should think about a sequence of statements that can execute more than once. This is very useful in programming where we want to repeat some kind of process or steps several different times. In Python, the main loop that we have is called a for loop. And its syntax looks like this. We have for, and then some variable, then the keyword in, and then a list of items. The list of items could be any standard list, or it could be actually some other type of generator that would generate a list of items. But for this class, we're going to just stick to some type of a list, or we're going to look at things as being a list. So in this image here, we have a list of items, but we're going to look at one item at a time. So each time through the loop, the first time through the loop, we look at the first item. Second time through the loop, we look at the second item, and so on. Execute that block of code, and then come up to pick up the next item in the list, and then process that. So the best way to do this is to look at some examples. So let's say we have a list here called words, and the first element in the list is Python, the second is the word is, third word is the, and the fourth item is best. So the first time through the loop here, this variable word will contain the value Python, prints out Python on the first line. Second time through the list, the value of word is the word is, and it'll print out the word is on the second line. The third time through the list, third time through the loop, the variable word is the value the, and the fourth time through the list, the variable word is equal to the value of best. So I'll leave it as an exercise for you to copy and paste this and to see the output. We could also, instead of quite often, we may want to do something similar to what we have here. We could actually hard code the list where we have the variable my list here, but we don't necessarily have to do that. And so we've got a list here, 1, 2, 3, 4. If we want to execute this 4 times, we could possibly do it this way. Another more efficient way of doing it, though, is to use the range keyword, where it automatically, you can think of it as generating a list of items. The first element in the list will be 1. The last element in the list will be the element that comes before the value of 5, which is 4. So it generates a list of the elements 1, 2, 3, 4. So these two are equivalent, this statement and this range statement here. So let's look a little bit more at the range statement, because you will see this quite a bit in Python code. You have the keyword range, the open parenthesis, the value that you want to start at, the ending value, and then there is an optional argument named step that is automatically set to 1 unless you specify some other value. So in this example here, for I in range of 1 to 5, print I. This will print out the values of 1 to 4, 1 on each line. One thing that's very useful is like summation, where we want to calculate the sum of a certain set of numbers. So to calculate the summation of values between 1 and 10, we could write it like this: sum is equal to 0. And then we say for I in range of 1 to 11. Remember, we've got our range, our ending range has to be one more than the last value we want in the list. And sum will add up sum and add I to it, and it'll print out the result. If we don't want, so far we've only looked at where we have a step equal to 1. If we want another step, the only difference that we have to make is to add a comma and then the step value as the third argument in the range list. So to produce a list of all odd numbers between 1 and 10, you would write it like this. That will produce a list, looks like this: 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. For loops are really important because we quite often want to repeat a set of actions for each element in a list. And this allows us to be able to, the for loop allows us to be able to do that. There's times though to where we want to loop through we want to continue executing a body until some kind of a condition becomes true, or while it's true. And so in this case, we have a while loop, and we can write it like this: while some true condition, and then colon at the end, and then a body that we want to execute each time. So this is how this would look in a while loop. You have some kind of condition, you test to see if it's true. If it does, you execute the block of code. And then once you're done, you come back up, test the condition again. If it becomes false, you just exit out of the loop and continue executing. This is really useful for like user input, to where you may be asking for somebody, let's say, like, for example, if you're playing a game, have you ever played a game to where it says, hey, would you like to play again? Yes or no? Well, if you've seen that, all of the logic, all of the code that's being executed for that game is being executed in a loop. And each time you press Y to play the game, it will then check to see if that answer is equal to Y. If it is, it'll execute the body again. If it doesn't equal Y, if somebody enters in like an N for no, it'll then jump out of that loop. And so that's what this body of code roughly is doing. Please type in yes or no. Actually, we're checking to see if they enter in anything else beside yes or no in this case. So one little example that you could do as a little side project is, what would you do to modify this code so that whenever you pressed Y, it would execute the code, but if you pressed N, it would stop executing the code, it'd jump out of there. In this example, what we're doing is we're asking the user to type in yes or no, because we want to see if we're asking the user if they want to quit or if they want to continue executing the code. We check the answer to see if it's in yes or no. If it's not a Y or an N, we then want to execute this loop to where we output an error, say, well, your answer is not a Y or an N. And then we ask them to enter that again. Please type in Y or N. So in this piece of code here, we keep executing this code until the person enters in a Y or an N. And in this case, it's an uppercase Y or an N. If somebody enters in a lowercase Y or N, it's still going to execute the loop and complain that it's not a Y or an N. So another little exercise that you might want to be able to do, and I think we've talked about it before with strings and things, to be able to change like 2 upper, 2 lower. You could change this example to also allow somebody to type in a lowercase y or lowercase n, and that's interpreted as an uppercase y or n. So that's another little exercise. Now, we need to talk about when to use fors, when to use whiles. It's best to use a for loop if you know the number of times you're going to be executing through a loop. Let's say, for example, you've got a list, or right before you enter the loop, you know you're going to execute it X amount of times. In other words, if your list that you're executing is, you can determine how large that list is before you execute the loop. You know you're going to execute it X amount of times. For a while loop, that is better for like user input, stuff like that, that we cannot predict when the user is going to enter in a valid value. And so that's a good example of when we would want to use a while, because we don't know if we're going to execute it 1 time, if we're going to execute it 100 times. We have no idea. There's no way to tell that before we enter the loop if we're going to execute it 1 time or 10 times. For a for loop, we're generally doing some type of an operation on some type of a list, a range. You can think of that as a list of items. We know before we execute the loop how big that list is. So it's best to use a for loop. Generally, whenever you're dealing with a list, that you're going to use a for loop. Whenever you're not using a list, you probably end up using a while loop. Here's some additional exercises. I know this lecture was a little bit short compared to some of the others. There's no need to make it any longer than what it needs to be, but I would suggest that you take one of these exercises here, maybe 1 or 2 of the exercises here, see if you can write a for loop or a while loop, and see if you can get it to work properly. We will go over number 1 because it's asking if we should use a for loop or a while loop. And so I'll go ahead and answer that in this lecture. The question is, you need to write some code to ask the user to enter in a loop. And you keep asking until the user enters in a valid number. Should we use a for loop or a while loop? Well, one thing to keep in mind, think about what we talked about a minute ago. We use a for loop whenever we've got some kind of a list or some range of values, something like that. So in this example, there's nothing to do with a list. We're asking the user for some input. Since we don't know if the user is going to enter in a valid result right away, we should probably use a while loop. The second example, you are writing a loop to examine each element in a list. Is that a for loop or a while loop? Well, since we're examining each element in a list, we'll use a for loop. We're wanting to write a loop to output all the primes from 1 to 100. Should we use a for loop or a while loop? Well, write a loop to output all the primes from 1 to 100. 1 to 100, we know that we're going to execute the loop 100 times. We'll use a range for that. So it should be a for loop. Number 4, you ask the user to enter in a yes or no prompt again if the user enters in an invalid result. Is this a for or a while loop? We're prompting the user. There's no list, so it should be a while loop. Number 5, look through a list until you find an item that starts with the letter A, for or while. Okay, since it's referring to a list, we've got a list of items, we should use a for loop. Even though some of these you could write it as a while loop, it is better to write it as a for loop. Now, why would I say that? Why is it better to use a for loop versus a while loop? Well, the for loop is going to be simpler. It's going to require less code, and that probably means then that there's less room for adding bugs, stuff like that. Even though all of these that I'm telling you that you could use a for loop, technically you could you could write them as a while loop, and you could write code that is somewhat equivalent, produces the same output. It just isn't the proper thing to do. And at this stage, it isn't really that important because the lines of code is only going to be a few lines different. But if you start writing really complex code, it will make a difference. You'll be more likely to produce errors if you write it as a while loop instead of a for loop. So it's better to not introduce those types of bad habits. So that's why I'm suggesting that you write it a certain way. In the long run, your life will be a lot less complicated. Now, the last two exercises here are actually programs that you can write to try to produce some type of output. I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to go ahead and end the lecture. But take some time and think about these additional exercises, the first 5 that I'm suggesting that you write as a for loop or a while loop. Think about them for a little bit. If you have to, go back and look at some of the notes, look at what we described here in this paragraph here that explains the difference between for and while, and until you can understand why you would use one versus the other. Thank you for watching this video. I will see you next time.